Welcome. I'm Valerie Fletcher. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. I welcome you today to Human Stories with Rebekah Taussig, my favorite storyteller. This is IHCD's effort to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the ADA by telling stories, because we don't think that there's a better way to connect people. In a world in which too many people are diminished by a habit of othering that has gained ground lately, it is difficult to think of othering people who are three dimensions. And today we are delighted to have Rebekah lead us in storytelling. And we are going to be sharing just the first five of the stories that we've been gathering. We're gathering 35 stories of people with lived experience of disability who are eager to tell their stories. And I am happy to report to you that people have been so happy to have that opportunity. It has not been difficult to find people, and we're going to continue until there are no more people who've come forward on that list. And we will share that with you as a web resource where you can click on a picture and get that story. They're all about 5 minutes. And I want to thank the people who've made this possible. This was a late brainstorm trying to figure out what had the most meaning in this complex year, and stories were what won out. And we have recruited our own team and a fabulous crew of interns to help us this summer. So I want to acknowledge PJ Moynihan, our producer, longtime producer, Remy Allegro, who is our assistant producer, Annabelle Nolan, Ava Zampano, Shannon Haley, and Karina Mom, who have all, in many cases, learned to be editors and documentary videographers. So we are very grateful to them. This has been a labor of love, and we are delighted to share it with you. So I am going to introduce our guest and host, Rebekah Taussig. And I'm going to give you a little bit of advice. If you haven't read something that brought Rebekah to many of our attention, and that is Sitting Pretty, which is right behind me here, the book that came out in 2020. And the book is terrific, and I read the book when it came out, but let me advise you, put Rebekah in your ear and listen to the audio book. For $15, you can spend a whole day with Rebekah and listen to Sitting Pretty. So Rebekah, please join us. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be in this project. And thank you to everyone showing up, everyone here today. I know that there are so many things for us to pay attention to. There are endless ways for us to occupy our brains at any given moment. And I feel really honored that you would be here, that we would be here together, connected. I'm looking at the chat and seeing all the different places that we're beaming in from, like from Tokyo to LA, Oklahoma City, all those folks in Boston and Kansas City people. And so I'm just thinking of us all beaming into our screens from around the whole globe, but connected together in this moment together, sharing this moment, gathering around stories. I happen to believe that stories are one of the most underestimated, most powerful forces on earth. I think something happens to us when we are invited to share our stories, and when we pause to really listen and receive another human story. Storytelling expands and deepens our understanding of ourselves and the people around us. And I think this practice brings us back to our humanity. And I think that's something that's always important. It feels especially important right now. So I'm just going to start with a story. So this story does indeed take place on a dark and stormy night. This was in Lawrence, Kansas. I saw we had a Lawrence, Kansas person here, so you know the terrain. And this was my first semester of graduate school, and I was hanging out with new friends, new grad school, new places and new people. And I was hanging out with two new friends, my new friend Shane, and we were on our way to hang out with our new friend Amanda. And it was a rainy night, so we sort of are dashing across this slick, wet parking lot, and we find shelter in the bottom of this apartment complex, and we're sort of huddled up together, gathering our bearings at the bottom of this towering staircase. And the stairs were not a surprise. We knew that Amanda lived on the third floor of her apartment building, so we knew stairs were going to be a part of the evening. But still, I kind of steeled myself for the next part of the evening, this ritual, the part of the night where my friends sort of divvy up the labor of getting me in my wheelchair from one place to the other. And so Amanda meets Shane and I at the bottom of these stairs, and she hoists up my wheelchair and sets off on going back up the 3 flights of stairs, this time with a 30-pound mobility aid in tow. And you can't see it on the Zoom screen, but it is here. This wheelchair is the main way that I move through the world. And I sort of grabbed the railing and caught my breath before Shane scooped me up and started carrying me up these 3 flights of stairs. So I don't know the last time that you were carried by someone, or how you feel about it. But for me, the feeling of being carried by someone when I'm neither their infant nor their bride, can be kind of an awkward experience for me. It's really intimate, you're like smushed up together like 2 teenagers making out on the couch, but you're also like completely dependent on them the way that a child would be. And I find the whole exercise to be like a little bit embarrassing and also kind of hilarious and a little awful and almost sweet. And so just to like cut through the weirdness of this moment that I'm having with my new friend, I start crooning in Shane's ear in like my best old-timey voice, and I start singing, "Isn't it romantic?" And Shane's like kind of laughing, but he's also like breathing really hard, and he's concentrating on not dropping me and catching the next step with his foot. And my shame about this whole situation is kind of like throbbing at this point. Like both of my friends are panting. I'm willing this moment to end, and finally we make it to the 3rd floor, and I'm kind of just like wild-eyed and shouting by this point, like, "Just drop me on the couch!" And Shane like gently walks me over to the couch and helps me down, and Amanda pushes my chair up next to the couch. And then they both collapse on the other end, just like trying to catch their breaths while I thank them profusely. There are a lot of layers to living in a body that is so often at odds with the built world. But one of the hardest parts for me of that whole setup has always been this feeling like I'm a burden on people, or that I'm extra weight, right? That I make things harder on the people around me. And it's the kind of feeling that can make a person think like, you know what, maybe it would just be better or easier if next time I just stayed home. So later that night, my friends carry me back down the stairs, and Shane is driving me home in the rain, and he's just like coming to himself, which is a very Shane thing to do. And I have my head against the window, just like silently spiraling. We had not been friends very long, and my brain was thinking like, is he going to think twice before asking me to hang out again? And finally, I just blurted like, I'm so sorry you had to carry me up and down those stairs. And I knew what Shane would say, because it's the same thing that almost everyone says in that situation, which is some version of like, "No big deal, easy peasy, like we wanted you there." And I know that all of that is kindly meant, of course, but I am there for the whole scene, right? Like I see the little beads of sweat and the strain, and I hear the labor, and I know that none of that is like easy peasy. But instead, Shane said something I did not expect. Kind of without thinking, he just said, "Well, I'm sorry, that apartment building doesn't have a good way for you to get inside." And it was the tiniest little reframe, but it honestly stunned me in that moment, because Shane, he wasn't denying the fact that there was a problem, that wasn't easy peasy. But he was saying, you weren't the problem in that situation. Like that design is not great. And that is a problem. And I really had never experienced that kind of situation through that lens in that way. The way that we arrange the world, a building or a classroom lesson plan, the way we arrange the world tells a story about who we imagine will be in that world, who will live in that world. It tells a story about who we believe belongs here. And so for me, after years of moving through the world in a wheelchair, I kind of grew up to believe the story that I didn't belong. And I didn't always believe that. I've been paralyzed since I was really young. I got my first wheelchair in the 90s, so it was definitely hot pink, and I did cover it with really tacky neon smiley face stickers. It was a very cute look. But I grew up like visibly physically disabled, and for a while I really did not make much of that. It didn't mean a whole lot to me. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and so I was always kind of just one of the pack. I played really hard. I like had perpetually scabby knees. I would make up these really elaborate dance routines in my wheelchair, like listening to Amy Grant in the kitchen, and I like pictured myself leading this whole troupe of dancers one day, and I was definitely the kid who would put on like a full regal dress up gown just to go to the library. And I think at the heart of it, I just really saw myself as a valuable member of the group. And that feeling of being equal and a part of things, it slowly started to disintegrate. It was kind of this slow and steady process of piecing together where I fit, where disability fit or didn't fit into the world around me. And I know for a lot of folks with disabilities, there are experiences of bullying and cruelty. And honestly, none of that was the case for me. The ways that I learned about disability, I sort of, they were communicated to me in like 1,000 tiny and enormous ways. I think the way that we learn about the world can be so subtle that often we don't realize that we're learning anything at all. And so for me, no one ever said the words like, "We don't want you around." But for the most part, I lived in a world that was not built to include me. I spent a lot of time on the edges of inaccessible playgrounds or gym classes or birthday parties, and I felt all of the social emotional weight of being stared at whenever I went out in public or treated as other, as having people talk to the non-disabled person standing next to me instead of me, or strangers asking like, what's wrong with you? Growing up, it was the 90s, so I think like most of the kids around me, I did hear messages like, you can be anything you want to be. But even as a kid, I was really skeptical of that. I thought like, really, what would that even look like? When I looked out in the world around me in real life or on screens, like I had never seen a visibly disabled doctor or teacher or newscaster or barista or vet, veterinarian. I didn't see that in the world around me. And so a decade or so of living in a lot of inaccessibility and social stigma and erasure from representation, I sort of pieced together what made sense in my head was that disability meant that you were on the outside. And I started to sort of see myself as fundamentally different. Like, I wouldn't have had this language at the time, but it felt a little bit like being an alien bobbing around through outer space, like light years away from planet Earth. And I was someone that people could like look up at and gawk at, or maybe even marvel over. But either way, I didn't belong. So what does a person do to survive that kind of setup? Like, what do you do when you piece together that you don't really fit in the world around you? You don't really belong here. I think there have to be a lot of different responses that people might have to that kind of situation. But for me, I learned to hide my disability, which wheelchairs are quite visible. But I learned to make my needs really small, go with the flow, pretend like inaccessibility doesn't cost me anything. Like whatever you do, don't make a fuss about any of this. Don't be an inconvenience. Don't be a quote unquote burden. Um, I've noticed in retrospect that I got really, really good at opting out of even attempting to do something that might inconvenience or require an accommodation. I didn't want to make a fuss. I got really good at opting out. And a tiny example of this, to maybe illustrate this larger pattern. Not everybody knows this about me. It's not on any of my bios on the internet, but when I was in middle school, I was really, really good at the flute. I was a great flautist. I was first chair in band. I was very proud of that position. I practiced all the time, and I loved it. I loved playing the flute. And when we transitioned into high school, the only way to participate in band was marching band. I joined marching band, and I couldn't picture myself in that system, and so I didn't talk to anyone about it. I didn't tell my parents or talk to my parents or the band instructor. I was just like, oh, I guess I don't play the flute anymore, right? I quit, and I made myself smaller, a little bit smaller, so that nobody would have to accommodate me. It makes me wonder if any of you have done something similar, know that move of opting out. So by the time I went to grad school and I first met Shane and Amanda, and had that moment with the stairs, I had fully absorbed this story that my unbelonging was somehow inextricably tethered to my body. It was a part of me. Now, I hope that it's very clear as we are all huddled up together listening to stories today. I don't buy into that story anymore. That is not a story I believe to be true anymore. And I credit a big part of that internal shift in me to storytelling, to hearing new stories about disability, new disability stories, and learning to tell my own story for myself. And when I reference like new stories of disability, I'm not talking about just like any story of disability. I'm talking about the kinds of disability stories that are told by the ones who know that experience. Stories that are told by those of us with disabilities. Historically, the experience of disability has been narrated by people who do not share those disabilities. For most of human storytelling, the people in charge of the stories, of our stories, were non-disabled doctors or teachers, maybe journalists, film directors, writers, which is how we have gotten all of these tropes that flatten us into a few little boxes. Disability stories that are triumph over adversity or tragedy worse than death, or maybe the bitter, angry cripple or the helpless victim who's waiting for the benevolent hero to save us. I mean, there we go. I didn't learn about the history of that fight for the Americans with Disabilities Act for disability rights until I was almost 30 years old. Isn't that amazing? I mean, in all of the history classes and all of the movies I watched, that told different stories of human history, and all the museums I visited, the story of disability rights was not one that I had learned. I was alive for almost 3 decades before I learned the story of the Section 504 sit-in of 1977. If you're not familiar with this story, the very brief Cliff Notes version of this story is disability activists, 1977, led a group of over 150 protesters, folks with disabilities, caregivers, into a federal building in San Francisco. And what started as a peaceful protest turned into a sit-in that lasted more than 25 days. This group of protesters wouldn't leave this building until the government agreed to implement Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And it was this little piece of legislation, like less than 50 words long, that would essentially make it illegal for any disabled person to be excluded from any part of public life that was funded by the federal government. So our public schools, public transportation, libraries, government buildings, and this little unlikely piece of legislation was really the beginning of forging civil rights for disabled people in the US. And in pushing to change this law, these activists were really insisting on a different story of what it means to be disabled, to have a disability. Growing up in the 90s, my experience of the world made me believe that I didn't belong. But somehow, like 40 years before I was even born, this group of people believed so deeply in our inherent belonging that they insisted to the people in power that they create a world that reflects all of our belonging. And this scrappy group of protesters lived in that government building for 25 days. Surprising no one, the federal government didn't want to implement Section 504. They claimed that the disability activists wanted too much. It would be way too expensive. They claimed it would actually be impossible to implement. And they were working really hard to shut this whole thing down. So they cut off the water supply in the building. They cut off the phone lines so the protesters couldn't communicate with the outside world or couldn't send messages to the press anymore. The protesters pivoted. They were like, turns out we don't need phones to communicate, and they used ASL to sign through the windows and continue to communicate with the press and the outside world. And finally, after 25 days, they pulled it off. They got the signature they needed. The government agreed to implement these regulations. And Section 504 laid vital groundwork for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law, bright, sunny day in the summer of 1990. So last month in July, we celebrated 35 years since that law was signed, a law that really tells a story of our inherent right to belong in our communities. And learning that story, I started to piece together that I was actually a part of an incredible history, an incredible legacy. I was part of a much bigger fight, a fight that we are still fighting for. And that recognition started to change me. But it wasn't just these like big, exciting, grand stories, although that is a huge part of this shift in me. But it was also hearing the stories just from ordinary people moving through the world with disabilities. And that changed me too. So right around the time that I met Shane and Amanda in graduate school, I started this Instagram account where I started writing what I called mini memoirs. They were just these little tiny tidbits, stories of life from my very particular point of view and moving through the world in this wheelchair. And it was a space, it was in that space online that I started to find so many people who live in the world of disability. It was really the first kind of experience I had had like that, like meeting so many people who understood experiences that I had felt so alone in. I had felt like the only one. And it did a few different things in my brain. I think witnessing these stories, it opened up my imagination of what was possible. For the first time, I'm seeing all of these folks with disabilities in romantic relationships, having adventures, traveling alone, having families. I'm about 98% sure that my son would not exist if I had not first witnessed other disabled parents online doing it first. I think witnessing all of these stories helped me understand myself, my own life experience in a new way. I started to recognize for the first time ableism out in the world, like what it was, what it looked like. I realized that some of the exclusion that I had experienced wasn't just something that I experienced, that I wasn't the only one on the edges. I literally wasn't the only kid on the edges of the playground in school when I was growing up. I wasn't the only one who had strangers approach me in public and ask to pray for my healing or ask what was wrong with me. I wasn't the only one trying to cope with strategies for being stared at in public. I wasn't the only one really struggling to find an affordable, accessible place to live. Or who found the maze of Medicaid to be treacherous, who lived in terror of losing health coverage. I over and over again, I said, like, you too? Like, you experience this too? Um, it helped me understand myself. But witnessing these stories also revealed to me just how wide and deep and sprawling the experience of disability can be. I heard from people who experience the world very differently than the way that I do. People with disabilities that are very different than mine, or people who had disabilities quite similar to mine, but still lived and thought and felt differently than I did. And as I witnessed this whole dynamic chorus of stories, people telling their stories, it was so easy for me to see that all of these people were obviously worthy of love and belonging, which made it so much easier for me to see that for myself too. And once I got a taste of this disability storytelling, I really, I couldn't get enough. It changed me, and it continues to change me. Um, I started to realize that that image I had of being that lone alien bobbing around through outer space like wasn't actually quite right. That there are actually loads of us out here, like enough to light up the whole sky, living on the edges for a host of different reasons. So the mini memoirs I was writing online eventually evolved into the book that Valerie introduced, Sitting Pretty, that came out in 2020. And is a collection of stories that I hoped would add dimension to the one-dimensional stories of disability that I had grown up hearing. And more recently, I wrote a picture book for kids called We Are the Scrappy Ones. One thing that I have noticed about the experience of disability um, is that we often belong to families who don't share that experience with us. Not always, but often. We are the only ones in our families or our schools or our communities with our particular disability. And I wanted to write a book that could be a sort of invitation anthem of belonging for kids with disabilities, to introduce them to this scrappy legacy that they're actually a part of. Um, I think so often it's easy to feel like our stories aren't important, like, why would anyone care about my story? It's very easy for me to feel that way, even now. But what I have found is that so often our stories are actually about so much more than just us. I think stories remind us that we're not alone, and they expand our imaginations beyond the limits of our own experiences. I think this practice of sharing and listening to our stories connects us, which is why I was thrilled and I'm so honored to be doing this project with the Institute for Human-Centered Design. I know that the crew has been working very hard to gather these 35 human stories in honor of the 35th anniversary of the ADA. So thank you, and shout out to the people who have been busy pulling those together. I know all of those stories will eventually be available online, but today we are so excited to be able to share 5 of those stories with you, 5 human stories of disability, and you will hear the ways that these stories overlap and deviate. You will hear stories of visible disabilities and disabilities that aren't apparent right away. You'll hear storytellers express different feelings about their disabilities, complicated feelings, different arcs to stories, like we are not a monolith, and isn't that wonderful? So we'll get to hear all of that in just a bit. For about a half an hour or so, we're going to tune into these 5 storytellers. We're going to share in one of the most human activities together, this gathering around and listening to some stories together. So thank you again for doing this, for showing up for this, for being the kind of humans that prioritize listening to each other and hearing our stories. I'm so honored to be present with you in this moment.
Rebekah, I couldn't be more pleased.
Oh.
And we all thank you for writing a book using the term scrappy, which is just a gift. I think we should all be wearing wearing perhaps hats to say we are the scrappy ones. So I'm thrilled that we have our first 5 stories that we're going to share with you today. There will be a minimum of 35. They will all be available on our website. Everybody who's participated also gets their own MP4 to use as they wish, because often they haven't told their own stories, and this is something to add to that. As Rebekah said, we've got a mix of physical and sensory and brain-based reasons for disability, and that's the reality of disability in the world. And we're thrilled to have them. We actually have also added 2 of the storytellers who are telling their stories today. They will be live with us following those 5 short video stories. And they, with Rebekah and myself, will field questions from your questions that come through the Q&A. So please think about what you want to talk about. Bring some bit of story or a question, whatever you'd like to contribute. But we expect that to be lively. We will also be recording that so that we can share that. When we share the videotape, we will also share that narrative of the Q&A, because today we think that feels very important. So we will let the filming begin, or let the videotapes begin. Remy, can you let those run now? And we have Anna Maria, Jessica, Paul, Lisa, and Rashma.
My name is Dr. Anna Maria Jones, and I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I grew up here dealing with issues regarding my parents. I'm back home now, and I've been caregiving, working on a PhD, and trying to get back into teaching college, but most importantly, also start creating a consulting practice where I can help neurodivergent individuals in the workplace as well in learning environments. I'm not an individual who had early intervention. Early intervention is so important to later successes. But nonetheless, I was labeled as slow, as having behavioral problems in K through 12. And I decided I would live up to those expectations, or little expectations that was expected of me in school. So I just kind of dealt with the circumstance of not being able to learn, going all the way to college now, and I'm sitting on a shuttle bus, and I hear a young lady talking about all these things that she has difficulty with, such as reading and getting numbers backwards and directions. So I said to her when I got off the bus, I didn't mean to be in your conversation, but I did hear some of the things you said that you're dealing with, and I really wanted to know, could you tell me more? And she said, yes, I have dyslexia. And she told me a little bit more. Within a week, I called my parents and was tested for dyslexia and found out that I had ADD back at that time. I think as a younger person that my family was very instrumental in the fact that I have had successes in life. I think when you are neurodivergent, having family support is extremely important. Also, having access to resources is very important. And that's because I feel like also my family had access to resources to pay for me to get tested and then pay for tutors to help me through college. And so that to me was a great thing. Family support is very, very important. I can't say that enough. And it's even important as you age, knowing that you have people that understand that you navigate a little bit different, that you may see things differently from everybody else, but that doesn't make them right and you wrong. I had to go look at what my legal right was, and that was when I really learned about the ADA, and it also was the beginning of my own advocacy and wanting to advocate for other people. And when we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, those are departments and those are words that are very important for individuals who are, who have differences, may they be mental or physical. So I'm glad that we're celebrating it, because we are in very difficult times and we're going to have to fight for change to come. I just think that it's very important that we acknowledge that, and that we also understand that in the workplace, that if we don't look at being open to understanding others, that we're going to make the workplace difficult. We want to be inclusive, because quite frankly, I always say people who are neurodivergent are highly intelligent people, simply because there are so many people that do not believe that to be the truth. So I want to fight against that, and I want to create awareness. Yes, I see myself as different, but I see the world as being the bigger problem. I see that the world, if they make the environment inclusive from the beginning, there would be no need to have words like different and disability, because we would just design inclusively from the beginning. We would design education systems that took into account that not everyone is a text learner, that not everyone can take notes, that there are people that are auditory learners, that are visual learners, that are kinesthetic. We are not inclusive in our design. So that is why we have people that have disabilities.
Hi, I'm Jess Grennan. I live in Missoula, Montana, and I am a political consultant. Probably in elementary school, I was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia and had to transfer schools to go to a place that could accommodate kids with special needs. I grew up with both my parents and a younger brother in Boston, and then we moved to Helena, Montana. I heard from a young age that I was bright, but had dyslexia and I had some deficits that it wasn't making things as easy for me to see from A to B as most people, but I could definitely get A to Z. And so having the ADA made sure that I got into the public school that had a program that there was 10 kids in my class with 2 teachers. That was an amazing benefit and gave me a foundation younger, and also some confidence knowing that I could do things other people couldn't, but some things were always going to be harder for me. I think it's always been tricky having the invisible disabilities, and that people always were like, work harder, do this, concentrate more, focus. And I think that's always been really hard. I also have pretty severe health issues where I had 7 surgeries in a 2-year period on endometriosis, which is also an invisible disease that I was hospitalized for the first time 26 years before I was diagnosed. And so I think that's always been hard, that when people want to just put you in a box, and that you would never ask someone, if someone was using a wheelchair, you would never ask them to run faster. But if someone has neurodivergency or dyslexia, you are likely to ask them to do things that it's not a matter of working harder. And I think that's always been like the real tricky part for me. It's like, it might take me a couple ways to hear information to get it, but then I get it and see it in ways that other folks don't. But I think the attitudes around, like, folks are making this up, we diagnose too many people with ADHD, and it's like, no, this is a real thing. Like, just because it's not coming into your brain doesn't mean it's not something that exists. So I think the attitude is really something that's really important for us to dig into. It's like, why is it so hard for us to accept someone else has a disability or needs accommodation just because it's not in our eye line? It's been complicated throughout my life. There are times I'm like, I wish my brain worked like other people's. I wish like I'm a people pleaser. I wish I could have pleased teachers. I wish like my handwriting wasn't something that like I get embarrassed to send thank you cards because of the way my handwriting looks or my spelling looks. There's a lot of, I think it's a complicated identity. And a lot of times in the disability community, you don't have family members that are part of it. You might be the only one in your family. And that I think is really tricky at times, that you don't necessarily have that support or that shared experience with the people that you live with. I think there are some benefits of having my brain work differently. I think I would be very grateful not to have chronic pain issues, but I don't necessarily see that all as an asset. I think there are some benefits to my brain working differently and seeing information and filtering it differently. I see patterns other folks don't. I think because I've always had to learn how to read differently. I had to learn how to get through school differently than a lot of other people. I think it can be an asset, but I also think it provides extra challenges too. I am more resilient because of it. I don't get thrown off when things don't go right, as a lot of other folks do. I can see diverted patterns. I can see alternate routes because I've always had to do them. And I think that is a real benefit. But I think having invisible health conditions and dyslexia and ADHD has also been really hard. I think people oftentimes misunderstand that folks with non-visible disabilities aren't looking for excuses. Like, our brains fundamentally function different, and a lot of the things in the world are not meant for us. And that doesn't mean they're good or bad. They're just not meant for folks that see things differently. I think having invisible health issues and chronic long-term health issues has been really tricky. I have an illness, I have endometriosis, which affects about 5% of the population. We know nothing about it, almost nothing about it. And it's considered one of the 10 most painful diseases you can have. And just even getting time off from work when I was not working for myself, when trying to explain why I needed all these surgeries. And there's also like a disappointment that you're not better right away. And I felt like I disappointed a lot of people by not being like, oh my God, the surgery was amazing. I feel great. I'm back to normal. Like, you redefine what normal is. And I wish people would understand that. I just find that like people really are casual about where they put, how they are really quick to dismiss people who have disabilities. And I think non-visible ones are often being dismissed for being dumb or not smart enough or not curious enough or lazy. And I'm really over that.
My name is Lisa, and I live in Boston right now. I have officially retired from work in biomedical research, but I am now into advocacy and doing things that will help make my city more accessible. I started thinking about myself as a person with a disability, I believe, when I finally had to give up my full-time job in biomedical research. And I had to fill out paperwork, and it really stressed to me that in order to receive help to survive, that I had to declare myself disabled. I'd say that I feel very fortunate that ADA was passed, because back in China, I could have been left by the side of the road because of an illness. But here in America, I have the opportunity to go to a regular education. I wasn't institutionalized the way a lot of other people were before ADA. I was able to go to college and study medicine, where previously that would have been unthought of. And I was able to work in pharma, which would not have been possible had we not had the ADA pass. And I find that I get more respect now that people are starting to understand that there are people in the world with specific needs, and that they can be just as functional and just as normal as everyone else if they receive just a few bits of help. Attitudes are very hard to change. I just came back from a cruise, and when I was in the airport going through security and customs, one man who was corralling us saw me go by and yelled out, "Handy coming." And then when I got to the next woman, she shouted, "I got a cane." And I find that really disrespectful. And I know it wasn't out of malice, but it was really hurtful that what it boiled down to that I was just a thing, not an individual. And I know that they don't mean it that way, but I think that the use of language gives other people the impression that people who have special needs are lesser and don't deserve the same respect as other people. The word disability is very difficult for me because I wasn't raised in a family that talked about disability. It was more that, you are an individual and you have X. So, my name is Lisa. I have lupus. I have a kidney transplant. I am legally blind. But it's not the entirety of me, nor is it my main identity. My identity is that I like stuffed animals. I like a challenge. I like roller coasters. I love to eat. I love dancing. I love listening to books. But it just so happens that I happen to have a kidney transplant. I'm still adjusting. I mean, it's hard to have to use the word disability in order to get help that, I'm not recognized by the government unless I declare myself disabled. But I see the need for a category, even though I would prefer not to be categorized. I just prefer to be Lisa with these special considerations. I think there's a lack of understanding on how to deal with people who have apparent disabilities. They think that they have a right to grab you when you should never be touched unless you've given permission. I think that people infantilize people with disabilities. There's nothing wrong with my head, but people talk to me like I'm a 4-year-old, and that's not necessary. I received a full degree in college. I can read the paper. I can, maneuver around the city myself. I think I just want people to see me for who I am and not for, the color of my skin or for, whatever disability they think I have or handicap they think I have. I'd rather they just treat me as a person and look at individual needs just as individual needs for other people.
My name is Paul DeFazio. I live here in Boston, and I'm an artist and an architect, and I work here at IHCD as a design researcher. The kind of legal protections that come from the ADA have, I think, always been present in my life, even though I think before I learned about the history of disability rights, I wasn't even fully aware of how they were present. So, for example, I went to school for painting in undergrad and had several doctors tell me that I shouldn't go to school to become a painter. And fortunately, because of laws like the ADA, actually doctors don't have authority over who gets to go to school for what. And before we had legal non-discrimination protections, those kinds of things did. Those kinds of questions were in the hands of doctors. There are examples of that in disability advocates books like Judy Heumann and others. So I think it enabled me a lot of freedom to kind of choose what I wanted to do, to make my own decisions. But I think the biggest thing that the anti-discrimination measures that come from the ADA created was this really big kind of like civil rights movement of disabled people in the US. So I think when I did start to identify more openly as blind, I felt like there was this legacy and history of activism, and in a way it was kind of like I was standing on the shoulders of all these other people who had done this work to create a sort of to destigmatize disability in the US and abroad. Yeah, I think I was exposed to the idea of disability being an asset first when I think I was reading about the deaf community and the term deaf gain, which is a word that's used to kind of counteract the term hearing loss, or the idea that hearing is defined by loss as opposed to the sort of like gain that comes out of deaf culture. And I've heard of other blind people kind of like using that term too, talking about blind gain, and the idea that you can that actually becoming blind is something that like opens up like a whole world. And I prefer that word, becoming blind, or that term, as opposed to something like vision loss or low vision, words that kind of like talk about blindness in terms of the things that you lose. And because sometimes I feel like my vision is really just different from other people's vision. It might be, blurrier, or I see light differently or things like that, but I don't necessarily see that as like having bad vision. There are many ways that the world kind of like completely just, you understand it in a different way when you become blind. When I was maybe 26 or 27, I had, I was reaching a point in becoming blind where I was starting to have trouble cleaning things. Like I was like, trying to just like wipe down counters and clean the floors and things like that. I would like miss dirt and like things. And so I had actually someone from the Texas Workforce Commission for the Blind come, and he was like, oh, like I can help you, like we can do like blindfolded cleaning in your house, which was kind of, and I was like, oh, that's like a strange, like I've never heard of anyone doing that before. And he came and, he would like give me sleep shades, and for an hour every week I would clean my house with a blindfold on. And it actually made me like see my house in a completely different way. Like I was like, he'd be like, oh, like stand here next to the kitchen, and like how do you know like you're standing in front of the kitchen? And I like think about it and I'm like, well, like you can feel like the edge of the floor with your foot. And he's like, okay. I'm like, what else? And I was like, and you can feel the heat coming out of the window on your right side where the sun's coming in. And he was like, okay. And like, what else? And I was like, okay. And you can feel the air coming out of the vent, which is right before the kitchen. So you can feel the point of airflow here. And so all of that became like a way to like orient myself in my house, just based on kind of like what's around. Like details that you notice about the world as a blind person can become more like intentional. And I would say in that way, being blind actually opened up being an architect in a very different way for me. Like I think I now notice very different things about the built environment than I would have beforehand, which, I think architecture is a discipline. It's very, the architect Chris Downey uses the term ocular centric. It's very vision centric. Being able to break out of that and think kind of beyond the ways of designing that are really familiar to everyone and we've almost become sort of unaware of them, has become actually a huge asset that blindness has brought to my life.
So my name is Reshma and I live in Boston. I recently completed my master's in global inclusion and social development from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. This program enables me to develop a strong understanding of social inequalities, power dynamics, and systems of oppression, while also learning how to critically analyze and challenge structural barriers that hinder inclusion and social development. So I have been deaf all my life, and I have been wearing hearing aids since the age of 1. And throughout my childhood, my parents consistently advocated for me so that I would not have to explain my disability. Also, it so happened that my hearing aids were so good that I never felt deaf. In fact, I used to bully other children because I was a very confident and extroverted child. Then I entered my teens, and it was around the same time that we moved to a new country and I joined a much bigger school. I was constantly surrounded by people whom I did not know and I had not grown up with. And they began to ask me, what is that, while pointing to my hearing aids. It was at that time that I started becoming conscious of my deafness and thinking of myself as a person with a disability. After I completed college, I got a job in a field that was not considered a traditional type of employment, that of a sub-editor and reporter. No one in our immediate circle of family members and friends, of teachers, doctors, and bankers had ever gone into an unconventional field, that is journalism. I enjoyed interviewing people and writing feature articles till there was a point where my editor asked me to do an international junket. At that time, my father put his foot down. He said it was not safe for a deaf person to travel alone and, stay with strangers. That was my first experience of how attitude shaped my experiences as a deaf person. I could not change his attitude that a person with a disability must be protected no matter what. And along the way, I carried that internalized ableism that I, as a deaf person, must have help, especially in new and unexpected situations. A turning point came when I met a deaf peer who was also from India, the country where I'm from, and she also grew up with the same societal barriers that I faced. She is a scientist in the US, and she told me that only if I handled new and unexpected situations alone, I would learn to think on my own and not depend on other people for help. There was another shift in the way I perceived society's attitudes towards disability, which came very recently. I met a blind scientist who said, the problem is that you start to believe what everyone tells you about yourself. You carry it inside you. I understood that if I knew my self worth, I would not let other people's attitudes, their opinions, their assumptions, stereotypes, shaped by their own experiences, I would not let that dictate my perception of myself. It is a learning curve. I'm still trying to undo all those years of internalized attitudes about disability, but I'm getting there. Disability is frustrating, exhausting, and isolating. Of course, there are captions and transcribing apps that have been around for the past few years, but I think we should acknowledge that disability is a spectrum. Intersectional identities must have adequate representation, equitable access must be prioritized, and on the whole, the system, which is still quite binary, must evolve and adapt to the changing times.
Thank you to our speakers. Excuse me. And apologize for a few glitches on the technology, but we certainly got most of those stories quite fully. And Rebekah and I are here, and we are going to be joined by two of the storytellers we've just featured. Lisa Chin is going to join us, and Jessica Grennan. And I can see Jess online there. We can elevate Lisa to being online if she is available for the visual screen. And we are inviting you to join us quite literally by coming up with questions for us. And actually, we have one. We're going to start here with this is for you, Rebekah, because it starts, "Hi, Rebekah. Nisha here from New Delhi, India. As a person with a physical disability, I find traversing the Indian workspace very challenging. There's not much representation or support available. I frequently face accessibility issues. Indian companies are still figuring out how to support people with disabilities. I'm 33 and want to create awareness like you do for my country and become a voice for change. Can you please give me some advice on how you did this and how I can do that too? Sending much love." What do you say? I want to also respond to that, Rebekah, but this is directed to you. Why don't you begin?
Well, I'll get us started. I'm very curious to know what other people would say, and Valerie or Jess, if you had anything you want to add to it. But I think thank you also for getting the ball rolling with questions and being the first question asker. And I love this question. I think the world we live in now, in one way, we all have access to sharing stories more broadly with the internet, with the world online. I mean, obviously, that's kind of how I started telling my story, and it wasn't necessarily strategic for me. I just wanted a container, a place to put stories, and this was 2014, 2015, and at the time, Instagram felt like a good container for that. And I did find that in narrating my own experiences that people found that and connected with it and amplified an experience that a lot of people weren't aware of, or helped people feel seen. And so I think in the world we live in now, there are lots of options for how to go online and tell stories and amplify things that people don't always see. I don't know if that's interesting to you. I will say that I think that can be effective, and also my own relationship with social media has changed a lot since I was there originally in the last 10 years. And I find myself really drawn to smaller pockets of community and how to make change and connection in that way. And so I don't know if this feels like an option for you or a possibility, but I've met with a lot of groups, companies in the States who have started affinity groups in their workplaces. So groups that invite folks with disabilities within a workplace to come together and share stories and sometimes communicate with people outside of that community to work together to share the experience and kind of talk about some of the things that would make a workplace more accessible. And what I've heard from people who start these groups and participate in them is that often they are really surprised to realize how many people in their workplace also have disabilities. The vast majority of disabilities are actually not immediately apparent to us. And so realizing that you are surrounded by those people can shift the experience of a workplace, sometimes starting just internally, but and then I think hopefully practically that is you can gather momentum around shared stories and change a workplace in that way sometimes as well. But those are just a couple of ideas. I don't know, Jess and Valerie, if you want to add anything to that, because I think it's a great question. And I think a lot of people are wondering similar things.
I'm going to jump in here because we have a deep commitment around what is happening in India and about really infiltrating the Indian sensibility with a conviction about the importance of accessibility and inclusive design. We are blessed to have a number of Indian staff. We have a long-term plan to actually, if all goes well, to actually one day before too long have IHCD India. That will be run by one of our Indian architects. There is recent legislation on accessibility mandates in India. I think that there has not been a great deal of impact from that yet. And I think part of it is that people aren't terribly aware of it. And it's not clear to us that there are penalties for ignoring it. And I think that's one of the things that in the United States, what distinguished us with the ADA is that we had an infrastructure of compliance, of information and expertise, and you were going to pay if you didn't do it. You were going to be vulnerable to getting into big trouble if you didn't do it. Much of the world has requirements for accessibility and no infrastructure to support it. And I think it may be that right now India is at that point, but I think there's such an abundance of incredibly talented people in India, and I trust you are one of them, Shwet. And I think people have to find each other. I mean, I think it's not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the top and the bottom. And I think this is a perfect moment because this legislation is fairly new and not much has happened yet. I don't know if Jess has any thoughts on this beyond that, or Lisa.
Just to Rebecca's point, one of my favorite quotes in politics is that issues divide, stories unite. And I think having the narrative and seeing what the real world applicability of this is really important. Theoretical discussions on change is always harder for people to grasp and for their imagination to get a hold of. But if you're explaining the scenario, and it's not fair that we always have to explain why things aren't built for us. It's bullshit. But if we can tell those stories, I think it really brings people in more so, and they can start seeing themselves in scenario planning. And I think that's why it's really important that we're talking about these situations and we're talking about what it means when a building doesn't have access, what it means when you can't reach a light switch, what it means when you can't get coffee, or what it means, like how that affects your day-to-day work, how you're seen as a professional or not having to always have the other entrance or things just not working for you. So I think these stories with like real examples are really important for all of us to talk about.
Thanks, Jess. Lisa, any thoughts? Lisa's muted. I'm not sure if she's yet live. For now, we can move on to the next question. So this is Chuck. I am in Seattle working as a part-time bus driver. I am working with our King County Disability Equity Network. I am struggling to move our organization from, oh boy, Chuck, we all hear you here. I'm struggling to move our organization from rhetoric to meaningful action. committing resources. What suggestions do you have for winning commitment from those with authority, challenging the unfulfilled rhetoric, create curiosity, leading to learning? Brilliantly said, thereby granting authority to those with lived experience. So well put. Rebekah, do you want to begin this response, please?
Yeah, I think I can speak to some big picture stuff, and then I feel like I know for sure, Valerie, that you'll probably have some substance and practical advice to fill in some of the gaps that I leave. But I think, I mean, honestly, what Jess said about the specific story is resonating with me in this case as well. I think sometimes it feels like uh, we want to argue why this is a good idea, which I'll speak to in a little bit as well. But I think sometimes just having a handful of specific stories that we can bring people to explain a specific example of like this is what this is a barrier for someone, and this is what we could do to remedy that, and to be able to picture a human life and a human story being impacted by that, I think can be effective. I tend to also think that in terms of how you the persuasive argument for why this should be done, in my mind, comes back to a couple of things. One is the fact that disability is universal. This is all of us. This isn't a small fringe category of people. This is like human beings. Everyone who lives long enough will experience disability at some point, temporarily or permanently. That's an inevitable part of life, which is just a friendly reminder. And then I think another piece of this is just pointing to all of the ways that access is created for an entire community when we design with disability in mind. When we design with disability in mind, and the really obvious simple example to point to is just the curb cuts and curb cut effects, and thinking of when we create this access for wheelchair users. In this case, we immediately open access for people pushing strollers and rolling luggage and scooters and food carts, and people with aging bodies or bodies in pain who might need to shuffle when they walk, or walking with children, right? Like we expand access when we design in this way. I think that's a persuasive argument, but Valerie, Jess, Lisa, what are some other things that can kind of fill in the gaps of how to actively do this work, this hard, important work?
I want to see if Lisa is actually present. We don't see her image. Lisa, are you there? Yeah, we're not seeing Lisa's. Lisa was on her way, so she was actually in transit when she.
Can you hear me
when we were
now?
talking. There you are, Lisa. Thank you. Any
I am
comments
so
on
sorry.
this? This is really the question about how do you get from rhetoric to meaningful change, and in doing that, to engage people with lived experience as the experts. And I have to acknowledge Lisa Chin is one of our favorite user experts. IHCD does extensive contextual inquiry research, learning from real people about what works and what fails. And Lisa has been working with us for years doing this. So Lisa knows a lot about the value of direct engagement of people. Tell us about that, Lisa.
Well, I think I don't want to use the word normalization, but really it makes sense to make ourselves be seen and become, the friend or acquaintance or relative to someone else who can say, "Oh yeah, I know someone who has difficulty with curbs." Gosh, it really does make sense to do curb cuts for everyone, because once a person in a wheelchair has a curb cut, then a stroller can, get off the sidewalk safely. An elderly person can get on and off the sidewalk safely. Uh, the rhetoric, the rhetoric comes from, I think, the people with the money and the power. And I believe that it just takes more of our voices to spread the word, more of our voices to encourage the policy that is going to drive force that will make all these changes for us.
Thank you, Lisa. Jess, any points here?
I have a couple. My Hi everyone. My background is in political organizing, lobbying. I run ballot measures, and that's how I got my start. That's what I do for a living, and that's my career. I think it's really important when telling these stories is to power map the decision makers on it. Disability is a thing that is in families, it's in communities. People have experiences, and figuring out ways to relate to the folks that are making the decisions and figuring out who is the best person to talk to that who's making the decisions is really important. And I would also say none of us have to do it alone. There are people who care about these issues in every town, every place, and having that network and you know is really important for doing that. But I think when you're trying to move people, figuring out what their point of view in the world is and who can help move them is often really helpful for me when I'm doing political organizing or a regulation change, is figuring out why is the decision maker there. And sometimes they're not making progress, quite frankly, because of a lack of imagination or they haven't thought to do it yet. Other time, sometimes there's other reasons, but you have to give people a compelling reason to be with you. And I think that's something we can do. And I think there are so many more compelling reasons to be with us on this and making sure things are accessible. But we have to we have to power map how that works.
Thanks, Jess. That's a really good perspective. One last thought, and this is sort of an incessant refrain of our organization. If it works well for people with disabilities, it works better for everyone. And we'll move on to the next question. And this is actually, we got some, the IHCD family is well represented. This is Tatiana Rivera-Saab, who is the director of the New England ADA Center, one of our projects. How do you reach people of color, share these stories about the ADA, especially because so many people of color never heard about the civil rights protections under the ADA? This has been a big priority for us. We're in the midst of a 5-year research project on it, and have found over and over again that people in communities of color have not gotten the good word about the ADA, even now, 35 years later. How do we change that? How do we? And we had one of our storytellers today is a Black American, in talking about her own struggles of being presumed to be of limited intellectual ability through K through 12. And this is a person who has a PhD today. I think anybody have thoughts on that? Rebekah, Jess, Lisa?
I think
I think,
grassroots is the key. Oops, sorry.
no, you go ahead, Lisa.
Lisa,
Absolutely.
Grassroots outreach is the key for people who are of color. Tea houses, grocery stores, churches, other places of worship, maybe playgrounds where people are out with their children. It has to be in a neighborhood from a source you trust. And we're blessed in Boston to have a lot of different outreach programs. And I think that this is a place where advocates for the disabled can maybe partner and get in there and start passing out flyers, talking to people, definitely in their own language, and saying, there's help out there, and your community can help you, and we can gather hundreds of people to help you. I don't think big fancy events help. I think really grassroots, the smaller the better, maybe block parties even. People need someone to trust, and we're not in a space right now where I would frankly trust anyone in government or from a big organization. But if, my neighbor were to come to me or my pastor were to come to me to say, listen, there are ways that you can get more help. There are ways that, you can make things safer for you and your family. I think that would be a good place to start.
Thanks, Lisa. Rebekah?
I have a specific angle on this that came to my mind first, just from my own experience and background and perspective as a storyteller, and how do we tell stories. Um, if you look at, and I love this question, I think as a storyteller, if you look at the few representations of disability that we do have on screens, or particularly on screens, but I think in literature as well, the few representations that we have are overwhelmingly white, and also more often than not men, and also more often than not wheelchair users. And often those wheelchair users have spinal cord injuries, right? So we have like this few sample of representations, and then it gets smaller and smaller in terms of who we're actually representing in the stories we do have. So one of the things that I have been invested in and excited about is working on a film telling about the story of the Section 504 sit-in that I briefly mentioned earlier, that part of our history. And one of the things that's incredibly cool about that story, and someone in our comment section named this, Hannah, thank you for adding, the Black Panthers were a huge part in keeping the protesters afloat in that 25-day sit-in in the building. And Brad Lomax, in particular, was one of the leaders of that movement. He was also a Black Panther, and worked in some of this coalition building of building a broader set of support. It was the Black Panthers, it was the Glide Memorial Church, and Gay Men of the Butterfly Brigade, it was Salvation Army, it was the mayor, like this big coalition of people. But the Black community was a huge part of that effort. And so in the telling of this story, this film that we're working on, it's been really important to us to make sure that we show the reality of this story as not a strictly white representation, white story, but there's this broad group of coalitions of people and participants and intersections of identities that are part of this world, a part of this experience. And so for me, I feel like in my very particular point of view and lens and role as a storyteller, I think part of it is representing the reality of disability as being part of every single possible intersection of identities, and very much a part of our story is people of color being a part of the work of this and being a part of the experience of this. So that's my tiny push for more of that, in that as we tell these stories, they let's broaden, let's tell more stories, and let's broaden the stories that we're featuring and telling and including.
Thank you, Rebekah. We've got one from Emma, who's asking a question of all of you storytellers, the three folks that are on screen now. This is for all of, it's for both of you, for all of you actually. How do you deal with the emotional vulnerability of sharing your story?
It's such a good question. It's such a good
It's a
question.
great question.
I don't.
You're first, Rebekah.
Am I first? Okay.
I think you have to be first because we
Volunteered yourself for that one.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think so.
I think this is one that kind of took me off guard. I love this question. Thank you for asking it. I think it part of why I love this question is I think that as disabled people, we're often it's often expected that we will share our story, and that we're obligated to share our story. I mean, right? That there's that sort of that pattern of people that I've experienced, and I've noticed other people experience, of being approached and said, like, "What happened to you? Why are you in that wheelchair?" And this sort of expectation that you will tell your story over and over and over again, and you will not be mad about it. And so I think that there's already sort of this built-in expectation. And I grew up talking about my stories from the time I was really little. I was like going to churches and schools and talking about disability. And so I think that there, in some ways, having a boundary at all is not often encouraged, or we're not really taught that. We're not taught that we're allowed to have boundaries a lot of times. And so I think I like this question because we're thinking, what are those boundaries? And we have every right to have those boundaries, and figuring out what those are. And I was very used to telling my story before I wrote my book, and then started to realize just how vulnerable that felt. And I think right after my book, or right when my book came out, I also became a parent, a mother, and felt much more guarded about what I felt comfortable sharing. And so I think I started out, when I started writing online and wrote my book, I was like, I'm an open book and you can know everything about every part of every corner of my universe. And part of that's because I was comfortable with that already from a young age. But as I've gotten older, I think I've felt myself becoming more mindful and intentional about what stories I share and what stories I hold back just for me and just for my family. Um, and I think part of what I hope and would want to encourage other people with disabilities to trust and believe is that you are never obligated to tell your story. You are allowed to keep all of it to yourself. You're not you don't have to be a teacher if you don't want to. You don't have to explain everything to everyone if you don't want to. It's absolutely legitimate and fine um, to keep your story to yourself. So I think I still am constantly wondering, like, is this story ready to share? Is this too close? Is this too vulnerable? And I think for me, the line that I have the lines I've sort of tried to create around sharing is, which are ambiguous, but I'll name them anyways, is usually needing a little bit of time or distance between when a story happens and when I share it. In part because I think I need time to process it, and I do not want to share a story with the world that is still fresh and raw and tender and unprocessed. So there are a lot of things that I share that I think are very personal, but as I am learning to do this work, my audience, my listeners, my readers can trust I'm not going to share that thing when it is still raw, and that's just the boundary and line that I've drawn for myself. I think it can be different for everybody, different for different people. So I'm curious about others, Lisa, Jess, how you navigate that, or what you think about the vulnerability of sharing your own story.
Thanks, Rebecca. I feel like I'm always living in a world of contradictions, that I'm like, the story's so important. You tell your story at risk. I want to be clear about this, that even as a privileged white woman, I have not gotten jobs because I've disclosed my health issues. I have not gotten, or my dyslexia. I've had progressive organizations grilled my reference checks if I was up for the challenge. I'm up for the challenge. I win. But it is done with risk. You tell your story. I want to be clear about that. And I think that's important to acknowledge that not people, it is a very competitive job market right now. And telling your story sometimes can have risk. It is so important, I think, to tell these stories, to bring people in, to talk about, and to make it part of the conversation, but there is risk involved in it. And I think that's important to acknowledge, that not everyone's there yet. And I think in terms of protecting yourself on it is finding places like this where this feels like a very safe place to tell stories. I also think, Rebecca, I just started listening to your book, which I'm ashamed this morning. I should have listened to it a long time ago. It's great. But I think for me, it's also humor around it too has been important, is that I don't really want to tell a story unless I can have some sort of joke with it eventually. It makes it easier for me to not just want to throw things at the wall. Like, I worked in a career for a long time where it was, you play real good when it hurts real bad. Um, I didn't get diagnosed. I was 26 years from hospitalization and getting diagnosed, right? And when I tell that story, and I know people have wondered if I'm up to running campaigns now, and that's a reality. So I think it's finding people that you feel safe to tell these stories with, I think, is important. For me, it's humor. Wine also helps, but it's also knowing why you're doing it, right? And it's a brave act. And I think, it's brave that we do this. So it's okay to congratulate yourself sometimes too.
Thank you, Jess. Lisa, anything to contribute here?
Hello. Hello?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yes. Oh,
Yes,
this
Lisa.
phone. My apologies. Definitely it's a risk to share your private information. You know, you have just as much right to not say anything as someone who has been the victim of violence to feel the need to do a Vulcan mind meld with someone else and share all of their feelings. It's the same thing as someone grabbing you without your permission. Um, it's you're not obligated. You're you're not in no way do you owe anyone an explanation about your disability or anything, really. I like to educate. I like to be cynical about my condition, but I guess sometimes it's just a vibe. You know when it's not safe to share. And I
Thank
depend on that very greatly.
Really good point that you develop antenna for knowing when it's safe.
Hmm.
We have an anonymous attendee who has an interesting question. What's a good lesson for being parents with disabilities? My wife is a manual wheelchair user, and I have ADHD and chronic nerve pain. We have a new 4-month-old daughter and already finding systemic barriers with most early childhood daycares not being accessible, and have decided to pay the disability tax of a nanny as we both return to work. Comments on that? I think Rebekah, you are a mother of a young boy, and your experience with this is so recent. Can you pick this one up?
Oh, I have my hands on my chest and my eyes are tearing up just with this question. And I think it's because it's a tender one for me, and I did not anticipate. I will preface this by saying, so my son was born, uh, what was it? 3 months before my book came out. So I wrote this whole book about ableism and my stories of disability, and I had, I could point out ableism and I could name it and I knew what it was and I could see it coming from a mile away. And then I sent off the final manuscript of that book, and it was like less than 24 hours later that I was surprised to find out I was pregnant. And so in the time that they were getting my book ready to send to publication and make its way into the world, I grew this person, and he was born a couple of months before the book came out. And I will say that I was personally really shocked by how strong my internalized ableism kicked in my early days of parenting. I didn't expect it. I had never, I was more frustrated with the limitations of my physical body than I had ever been in my whole life combined. It was a unique time. And I think, um, yes, I think I was used to, and as I'm sure this question asker and partner, you have been used to going out in the world and experiencing inaccessibility. It feels really different. It felt different to me to experience inaccessibility and stigma with a child attached to me or next to me. Um, I felt more thrown by it. I felt more angry about it. I felt it was just a next level of experience for me. Um, what I would say made a huge difference for me, especially in that early time. Um, that window of time, I'm thinking 4 months old is such a little tiny baby in a little tiny moment, right? Like there's a uniqueness to those early days of parenting. And one of the things that was the most helpful for me was connecting with other parents um, who shared my disability in some ways and could process um, the emotional experience, could troubleshoot and brainstorm accessibility hacks, who could think about alternate paths and routes through some of these parenting experiences. It's interesting, even just like with baby equipment. Um, you go shopping for a high chair or a car seat or a crib, and they are all designed for parents who are not disabled. And so even just like figuring out what are the tools we can use, having a connection with parents who share that disability was invaluable to me. I think now there are even my son's 5 now. Even in the last 5 years, I think there have been a lot more groups started like online that I know because I'm a wheelchair user. I know specifically of several wheelchair user like private Facebook groups that you can join that have parents who also use wheelchairs. I'm sure there are many more that I'm not aware of, but that to me was made a huge difference. It's connecting to people who understood the experience. I found that trying to process the experience of being a disabled parent with non-disabled parents, and could be different for everybody, but for me, I found myself feeling pretty erased and frustrated by that experience. I found that often non-disabled parents would say things like, "Oh yeah, new parenthood. That's how all new moms or new dads feel." And it was like, but there's something particular here that I need to be seen and I need help with that's different. So I hope that's at least a beginning idea. I could talk for the next hour about parenting with disability, so I'll just cut myself off there.
Actually, would you do them a favor and talk about your blog, please?
Oh, my Substack?
About parenting. Yes, your Substack.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. My Substack, I mentioned just a moment ago briefly in terms of my shifting relationship with social media, and I started on Instagram. I am not there quite as much as I used to be because I've pivoted to Substack as a platform. I found that that platform allows for more space. It's a slower medium, and so I feel like I have room to sort of delve into the more complicated experience of disability, and parenting is one of them. Of sort of untangling and processing what this unique experience is, and all the both and Jess said she feels like she's always full of contradiction. Same, especially around disability. All things disability and parenting for me seem to be full of contradiction and complexity. So yes, so I have a Substack. It's called This Too. This too tattoo on my arm. It's an important phrase to me that means that as soon as we, it means a number of things to me, but part of it with the Substack is this idea that as soon as we look at the thing, I want to add another layer. This too, and this too, and this too. There's so many turns and angles and layers to the experience of disability and parenting. So yeah, my Substack often delves into some of those unique experiences and feelings and stories of disability and parenting, and through the perspective of a wheelchair user parent, a parent with a lot of invisible chronic illnesses. And yeah, my son is a giant now. I mean, very quickly he is like going above my eye line, like he's quickly going to be taller than me. So I'm 5 years in. I know there's a long road ahead too, but that's where we're at.
Thanks very much. I want to keep going. We will eventually run out of time, but one point from a college student with a disability that involves both mobility and speech, and is a very successful college student. And he's asking about it, it's beyond physical accessibility. And part of it is his own experience with disability etiquette, understanding, helping people understand how to interact when they may have limited experience with people with disabilities. And the other is a recognition that ultimately it's about inclusive design or universal design and equity. Any thoughts on that? I mean, this notion of disability equity, disability etiquette is one where, the old ways of doing it are not quite adequate to the reality of disability in America today. We have to be thinking about a much more varied experience of disability. Any thoughts on that? Rebekah, Lisa, Jess? Rebecca, you want to begin?
Yeah, I can. I feel like I've been hearing my own voice a lot, so I'm like, Jess and Lisa and Valerie, I want to hear from you. Yeah, briefly, I would say, it's interesting. This anniversary, this 35th anniversary of the ADAs, has felt really layered. Of course, this is me talking. This too, layered, both and, because it's really interesting to see how different how transformative the ADA was, like is, how that has changed the world, changed and started in the US, but I mean like this is a global shift of shifting conversations around accessibility and disability in the last 35 years. That's been a shift. It's changed so much. And also even just in my story, I'm talking about growing up after the ADA and still experiencing this living on the edge and feeling other and feeling like a tiny alien floating through outer space, right? So it's interesting to me, it's noteworthy to me to look at all that the ADA has done and then to think about the limits of legislation, what goes beyond like a specific law. And I think Tripp is doing a really good job here of naming like the all that goes beyond that like concrete law. I think so often I interact with groups and do talks and meet with people and talk through in Q&As, and so often I find the questions of people wanting like specific checklists of like what exactly do I need to do to make this space accessible? What is the checklist of things and what are the things I should say? And really, really wanting a concrete, specific, tangible list so that we can check every box and solve the problem and then it's done. And I think there's a usefulness into that. I'm not like anti-checklists. I think there can be a function and a usefulness of that. But I often feel like I'm encouraging people to like we can't replace checklists can't replace like human connection and seeing people as individuals and having conversations and listening. I think a lot of times we prefer the checklist because interacting with the individual humans inevitably feels uncomfortable and awkward and we're going to get it wrong and we don't want to get it wrong, so give me the checklist so I never have to wonder and I know exactly and I never have to have that uncomfortable moment when I say something wrong. And I think what I think of with this question is just wanting us to grow in our tolerance for discomfort and our ability to be in conversation and listening to other people and learning to pivot or do something, learning something new about ourselves or our space or our community because we're listening and we're present with each other and we're connected to each other. I think obviously legislation is important. I think checklists are useful, but I think if we want to move beyond, we want to push further to create like spaces that feel inclusive, where you go in and you're like, I belong here. I think that requires connection and listening and being present with each other. And I think it's a skill that we are increasingly losing, that our tolerance for being human together and listening to each other. So that's a big picture.
We will not get there without attention.
Yeah.
And the standards are a low floor, a great baseline,
Exactly.
but they are a low floor, and that they don't even speak. Some of our storytellers today have disabilities that aren't addressed whatsoever in legislation, in standards. And we need to learn what do people need in order to feel welcome, to feel part of the community by learning what works and what doesn't. So I think really important. Jess or Lisa, do you have anything to say on that one?
Definitely. The checklist is for the policy. You have to have checklists for policy because policy is very, A, B, C, D. But there's a large part of it that is about human communication and not being afraid to go up to a stranger and say, you're from a country different than I am. What is it like for you being here? Tell me about your culture. It's the same for someone who may be in a wheelchair or who may be blind or who may have neurodivergence. I'm not familiar with this. Is there something I can do as a friend, as the secretary who's checking you into the doctor's office? Is there something I can do to make it more comfortable or more accessible for you? Those conversations don't happen because we don't even talk to each other anymore. I say hello to people on the street and they ease past me, clearly because I'm quote unquote in the way, but never looking at me, never saying anything. And that's a bad sign for any kind of communication or understanding in the world. And it's why we are why we are where we are today, I think, politically and as human beings. All you have to do is just ask. And the other person has the opportunity to either answer or say, no, I'm not comfortable with that, but I'll tell you this. My feeling is that it's all between individuals, and that's where it spreads. That's where it should start.
Thank you, Lisa. Jessica, anything?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we need, and I really appreciate you bringing up the speech impediment. I spent 13 years in speech therapy classes, twice or with speech therapists twice a week. And, I'm still very intimidated when I get on a call and it's a name I haven't heard before. I'm like, I'm going to say it wrong. So I come up with all sorts of workarounds. I'm like, hey, friend, how are you? Because I'm so embarrassed about pronouncing a name wrong, or someone's going to think I didn't care or wasn't intentional. And it's like, oh no, please don't. Please, it's the same panic when someone asks you to write on a flip chart during a group meeting. It's like, oh no, please don't ever ask me that. But I do think, one of the things with the checklist and where we're at now, I think we always have to consider that it's a continuum. What's a gold standard today or what's on the checklist today, we might find things that we can be better. So it's not it's making meaningful changes with policy, but it's not done. We're not done at the end of this one. We are inventive creatures. We're going to figure out better ways to do it. And I also think there needs to be more flexibility in terms of what final product is. And we need to have different metrics. My mom is actually on this and she will attest to this, but every year I go to New Zealand, I end up having to pay an extra $150 because I invert a number on the passport form. It happens every damn year. They know who I am. They won't refund it. And I'm really annoyed by it. I'm really pissed off by it, to be quite frank. Like, it's a disability tax that really has no bearing on security or me getting in the country. It's a way to penalize people who maybe aren't neurotypical. And I'm really furious about that. But I think we need to keep examining, like, okay, this works for me, but is it working for someone else? What can we do better? And knowing that we are never done. Val, you're always going to have a job because we're never going to be done with this, and we're better. Like, I think about like the kids that I see in high school now, how like more in touch they are, and like how they're really using considerate language, and they're trying to come up with more. They're more aware than we were, right? And it's just not going to be done at like we are always going to do better. And I think that's kind of where I land on a lot of this.
Thank you, Jess. I think for our nickel, part of what we need to aspire to is really understanding how to create experiences, an environment that delivers experiences for the broadest spectrum of people. We have a terrific anonymous attendee who is asking something terribly important, and I'd like to at least give this an opportunity to be aired as we start to close. I am a postdoctoral researcher. I am disabled, living with/without cancer. In the academic world I move in, everything seems to revolve around excellence, constant output, competition, perfection. At the same time, structural ableism makes it difficult to be recognized if you do not match these narrow criteria. My question is, how can disabled scholars communicate their work and survive in such an environment, one that constantly measures us against ideals of excellence and leaves no little space for imperfection? That is a terrific opening, my friend. Rebekah, do you want to begin that one?
Well, I'm feeling this question in my body. I'm having flashbacks to graduate school. I feel this so hard. And gosh, I'm thinking like, what can I even offer this person other than just like endless solidarity? Yeah, that was 100% my experience of graduate school. I often felt like, um, especially the shock of that first year where I was adjusting to like, what is this world and this system? It felt like it was specifically designed not for any humans. Like, no one who is supposed to thrive here. I mean, even just like a small example of that, like even just the amount of reading that a professor would require in a class for a week was like, no one is reading this. No one is reading this volume. Not a human. No humans in this room are reading all of this, right? And sort of kind of bumping up against this like uh, inhuman expectation and game and chase. And so I guess I would start by saying like, who do I feel that with you? And I think that we're talking specifically as, you know, a postdoctorate researcher, but I think that this also applies to a lot of workspaces as well. I think that there are other professions that also have similar setups. Like, what human being is supposed to win at this impossible game, and how do I survive here? How do I succeed here? How do I gain recognition here? And I feel like part of what makes this difficult is that the system feels very rigid. It's already there. It's already established. These are the goal markers. These are the posts, and these are the things you're supposed to do. And as a postdoctoral researcher, how do you come at that sideways in a way that allows you to remain human and also work within that system? I think for me, what stands out to me actually is, or what's coming to my mind is actually my first job out of graduate school, which was also an environment that required endless going and making and accomplishing. And what helped me survive that space was finding other people, like creating a pocket of community of people who also didn't fit exactly into that system, and finding ways to support each other, and kind of create that interdependent web of support that could kind of keep us afloat in a system that felt like it was asking an impossible amount, that required something that humans shouldn't that doesn't kind of honor humanity. So like creating a little bit of an intersectional web helped. I also will say there's this fine line, and we kind of talked about this with other questions already today about sharing stories, pushing against a system versus the risk of that, and when will you be punished for that? And I think as much as we can, put up a red flag and resist that, or show a different way to each other, like modeling that for each other, being human in front of each other, showing our limits in front of each other, as much as that feels safe to do, I think is powerful and important. I think one of the things that happens when you are operating in a system like that is that we're all incentivized to pretend like it's not a problem, that this is fine and it's working and we're doing great. And you look around and you're like, I'm the only one struggling. I'm the only one who can't keep up with this. And that's never true. It's never true. And so as much as we can find ways to throw up that red flag and show our humanity to each other in a system like that, I think the better. And ideally, I think when we find that community of people, then eventually that can lead to communicating that to people with a little bit more power potentially. And then the last thing, I had one more thought, but last thing. This will be my last thing, and then I'll be quiet. one of the things that helped me a lot when I was in grad school also was finding disability studies. And these were often academics with disabilities operating within academic system. And so finding those people, connecting with people who, with other people who have disabilities in academia, I think is invaluable. Okay, those are my thoughts. I'm curious what other people think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rebecca, I agree with
Jessica.
everything that you said, but I think one of the things to note is that, has anyone ever had to deal with their insurance company? I'm guessing
Yeah.
a lot of you. Yeah, exactly, Rebecca. That is the face. The systems are designed not to work for us. It is designed to knock us down. Let's just be clear on this. There are systems, they don't want us filling out the paperwork correctly because they want to turn us down. And I think that's just, if you're feeling like you're always getting gaslit, like, oh, it's just a simple form, it's so easy, anyone can do it. It's not. It is meant to, it's meant to demoralize you, a lot of this. So I want to just put that out there, that some of these things that aren't accessible, it's done on purpose to try to keep us from our real power. And I think that's just important to note, that like a lot of the things that feel overwhelming for me, it's not just overwhelming for me or undoable for me. It's meant to be that way for a lot of people. And I think that's just important to note. I also think, like, as Rebecca said, they like, there's also this feeling that you should always be happy, like, oh, it's so great you thought that, maybe I need a ramp and you didn't get an elevator. Like that, you're supposed to be happy at any bit of accommodation. And I think that's something we need to push back on too, like that, not good enough. And so I think it's hard, thinking of these systems, what can work, but I do think there is, I like that, Solomon. I do think there is hostile design out there, as a way, I'll get a little political, but it's for people to make money. And we need to push back on it and call it out when it's happening.
I want to jump in a little bit here, because I'd have to say that the tyranny of advanced academic departments and programs, as well as many other workplaces, where there is a tyranny of expectation that you work 24/7 and you crank and crank and crank, I think is something that is designed to be unwilling to hear the reality of where disability intersects with constant labor. And I don't think we have a good answer on this, but it is something that people are talking about more, are saying, why aren't these things being discussed as pertinent to disability? And I think we have to, we have an anonymous attendee who brought that up, but I think it is really important that we find a way for this to be a broader conversation, because I am not in any way diminishing what I believe is true, that there is a tyranny that I think is only going to get worse. That people have to understand these are realities. This doesn't mean that people are limited, that they can't deliver. It means that there has to be a different understanding about flexibility and accommodation and respect.
We need to define wins differently.
Pardon?
We need to be more open of what we're defining as wins, or like what, what the real purpose is, not just like a check off in like an HR computer system program.
There's one of the attendees, I'm just looking, we're closing, we're going to be closing very shortly. So what are the kinds of competencies, intelligences, modalities of working, modes of review, teaching, etc., that disability brings to the entire work culture? It is this is a question, I believe, about the asset of disability and the reality of it, and that it is not all negative. Anybody want, let's just give each of you a chance to take a minute on that one. What does this bring to the work and academic culture, since we've just been talking about it? What do you bring that culture sorely needs and can benefit from? Well, why don't we start with Jessica and then Lisa, and then let Rebecca have the last word on that.
Thanks.
What do you bring to it, Jess?
I am creative. I don't get hung up when things don't go right, because I assume they won't go right. I just assume everything's going to be screwed up and I'm going to have to figure out contingency plans. And I kind of operate that way. I also know I have to work, like, I have to work twice as hard sometimes to get half as far. And I think that work ethic and not being freaked out, and also knowing like when folks bring an idea to me that isn't in like the DC playbook, I'm more receptive to it. And I think that's been really useful in my career. And I also think, quite frankly, I couldn't I couldn't necessarily fulfill the checklist academically when I was younger. So I think I got pretty funny and I had a personality that people wanted to connect with. And I think I built some of that because of my disabilities.
Thanks, Jess. Lisa, any thoughts?
I guess I am thoughtful, I am dependable, I am resilient. I get along well with coworkers in any environment I've been in. And I think that just as a human being Asian and being female, being someone who is well read and loves to be curious, I feel like that those would be assets in any company. And it's just sad that people don't recognize assets and only see you as a liability or an expense.
Just a thought before I turn this over for our last comments to Rebekah. But one of the things that we've encountered with great frequency, unfortunately, getting more and more frequent, is that people with disabilities will have a terrific experience of multiple job interviews. And the last interview doesn't work out, and they're not offered the position, and they're told, you just don't fit into our culture. And I think we have to find ways to combat that idea that if your culture is so rigid that somebody whose brain works differently, somebody who has a different perspective, who sees things other people don't, is an asset. And maybe your culture has to change. Rebekah, on to you, my friend, my favorite storyteller for the last comments here before we close today. Rebekah.
Whoops, I muted myself. All right. Yeah, I think this question makes me think about the first word that popped into my mind was that word scrappy, that we talked about earlier, right? I mean, I think the reason that I chose that word for the book and the reason that I feel so connected to that word is I think that while there are so many different ways to experience disability, it looks like so many different things in the world. One thing that we have in common, I think, is some kind of mismatch with the world or systems around us. There's something that is not a perfect fit. And I think we often generate a certain sort of scrappiness through that mismatch. And when I think of scrappiness, I think about, like Jess was saying, that creative problem solving, that we build these muscles of always looking for the other way to do something. There's always another way to do something. And we create flexibility with that, right? That we can find other routes and alternate paths. And, that thing that Jess said about like expecting it to go wrong, I expect barriers all the time. And so developing that skill that pivots and jumps over or roots underneath or whatever that thing is. I think that scrappiness, that flexibility, that creative problem solving, that and often that humor that comes with that scrappiness is something that I value about myself, even as it comes with a both and, right? But it's something I value about myself for sure, and I think is an asset to a work culture, academic space, whatever that community might be. Thank you for the time and attention, and for the invitation, and for everyone who shared their stories and the people who worked on weaving those together. It's been an honor and a joy and a privilege.
Thank you, Rebekah. Our privilege indeed. And to the audience and to people who couldn't make it today, this whole broadcast will be archived and available on our website. We just have to edit the captions. But we will do our best to share the Q&A also, which I think was extremely valuable. Warm thanks to Jessica and to Lisa for being able to join us. and warm thanks to everybody who's participated in sharing their own human story.